first real item on our agenda is the Russell Lecture. And the Russell Lecture honours the contribution that Walter Russell made to soil science. And Walter Russell is probably best known as the author of the 8th, 9th and 10th editions of the book Soil Conditions and Plant Growth, which was originally authored by his father, Sir John Russell, who was also a soil scientist and director of Rothamsted Experimental Station from 1912 to 1943. So Soil Conditions and Plant Growth, the book, has been central to the evolution of soil science and the training of soil scientists across the world. And I'd say today it's probably still the go-to soils textbook. And actually I wonder if there's anybody here that actually hasn't at some point dipped into that book. So in part, I think its popularity is because it encapsulates quite elegantly the interplay between soil physics, chemistry, and biology, and yet it's extremely approachable for readers from a wide range of subject backgrounds. So Walter Russell was born in 1904 at Wye in Kent, and in 1930 he joined the physics department at Rothamsted, and it was there that he undertook the research for which he was probably best known. And this research really laid the basis for minimum tillage methods and techniques of no or zero till. And such management approaches are coming into their own, I would say, in helping address the global challenges that are overarching the Sustainable Development Goals, and for which the interplay between soil physics, chemistry, and biology have never really been more pertinent. And so it's my great pleasure today that this year's Russell Lecture is to be given by Professor Cheryl Palm, whose research career has centred around the issues encapsulated within most of the Sustainable Development Goals. So Cheryl is a research professor in agricultural and biological engineering at the University of Florida. By training, she's a biogeochemist and tropical ecosystem ecologist. So her research focuses on land use change, degradation and rehabilitation, and ecosystem processes in tropical agricultural landscapes. So soils are her entry into these systems, and she's conducted research in a diverse agricultural systems across the tropics and has spent much of the past 2 decades investigating soil nutrient dynamics in farming systems of agriculture, including the options for soil and land rehabilitation. So this includes 10 years working at the Tropical Soil Biology and Fertility Program in Nairobi, in Kenya, and I think that's where we first met. She's currently working on indicators and methods for assessing and monitoring the sustainability of agricultural intensification. So Cheryl, I'm absolutely delighted that we're able to host you here today, and I now please hand over to you for what I know will be a very inspiring Russell Lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm quite honored to have been invited, especially to the Russell Lecture. It is a book. I can still see the cover of it. We still have it on our shelves at home. And my husband, I think, has editions 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, however far they go, and he keeps all of them. So it was quite a pleasure to be invited to this. One of the SDGs that we didn't actually mention, but that is critical, is SDG 5. Does anyone know what that one is? It's gender equality. When I first started out as a soil scientist, this room would have had maybe me in it. When I first started in soils, I was often the only woman at all sorts of meetings. So it's fantastic to see the number of women involved. So soils does enter into SDG 5 also. Okay, so I'll give you, here's the outline of my talk. I'll talk about SDG 2 a little bit, but not as much as was previously discussed. Then I'll talk about trends in soils and food production in the past, and now currently soils and food security or insecurity. And I'll spend much of the time talking about work going on in Africa to address this issue of soils and food security. It's work of many, many people, many, many institutions. I'm trying to summarize quite a bit. It'll be a brief overview of a lot of things, so you can please ask me for questions later or references or anything. And then I'll finish it with this sustainability part as one of the second parts of SDG 2, but it's also the one on life, SDG, I think, 15. Okay, so Sustainable Development Goal 2 is to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. There are many targets. There are many, many indicators. I think for all the SDGs, there's like 160 indicators. I'm not going to go through those. Soils is not mentioned. Again, if you try to find the word soils, it's rather difficult. But I think these are the two that are important for this lecture today. To double the agricultural productivity, and I think that's what I'm going to talk about mostly. Talks about small-scale food producers, particularly women, family farmers. Okay. And then the other part I'm going to talk about then is the sustainable food production systems, resilient agricultural practices to help maintain ecosystems. And again, that's where soils are critical. And those are the two that I were thought most relevant, the sub-targets of SDG 2. Food security, just briefly, is defined by FAO when all people at all times in a geographical area have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Well, that's a lot, but many of us in this room don't really know what that means. But there are many people that do not have that. And there are dimensions of it. One, availability. Is there food even there? Are people producing enough food, or does it show up in markets? If it's in markets, do you really have access to it? Do you have enough money to buy it? And then utilization, that's if you have food and you can eat it. If your system, digestive system, is compromised by malaria or other things, you're actually not able to use that food. And then stability over time. So there are many dimensions to it. And for the SDGs, they've introduced this called Food Insecurity Experience Scale. And there are 8 questions if you go to the FAO website. So they ask people about the amount of food they've eaten. Have they have enough? So it's 8 questions. And then they sort of look at if it's food insecurity and the severity of it. So the SDGs also have how do you measure certain indicators. All right, so as we all know, populations concentrated on fertile soils. Why? Because they could produce food. And they were usually in great alluvial soils, the Nile Basin, India, China, places like that. So many of these early civilizations were on fertile alluvial soils. One I point out here is the fertile inceptisols of the Indo-Gangetic Plains versus neighboring state of Bihar, which has ultisols right next door, and they don't produce enough food there. Whereas in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, that's where huge, huge increases in food production happened on fertile inceptisols. Then the other ones are volcanic soils that are very, very fertile. So the Andesols of Java, the highest population densities are in Java, compared to the outer islands of Indonesia, which are usually oxasols and ultisols. Pardon me for speaking the US soil taxonomy. That's what I grew up on. So if you need a translator, somebody jump up. And then Central America, Costa Rica has rich, fertile volcanic soils. And then Central and East Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, parts of Congo and Kenya, derive from volcanic ashes. Those are where you find the densest populations. And at some point, food security, until they get too dense, and that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about East and Central and East Africa. All right, so all agricultural systems start by slash and burn agriculture. Doesn't matter where you are. I lived in New York State for a while, and you could still see a few apple trees on this farm that was no longer a farm, it was a forest. But anyway, you slash and burn forests to grow food. And in this graph, it shows different soil types, whether they're clay, loamy, sandy, different pHs, different fertility, and then the number of crops you can grow after clearing that forest. Because you just slash and burn, you plant a crop, harvest, plant another one, or you intercrop. And you'll notice some of the soils can grow many, many crops before you have to abandon it. Is everyone familiar with slash and burn agriculture and shifting cultivation and fallow systems? So here's this, an intosol, again, a river soil with sweet potatoes. A loamy alpha sol in Sudan, several crops before you have to abandon it to fallow. Over here you see acid infertile ultisols in Congo and the Amazon. So people at that point, what were they doing? They were exploiting the soils, the natural capital, the nutrient capital of those soils, until they couldn't get anything out of them and they had to abandon them to get more crops out of them. So this is what happens. Slash and burn, crop production, it's good when you start out. It drops, but the rate of drop differs with the soil type. And you get to some point, so you can let the fallow grow and you'll get your ecosystem services back. If you want to keep cropping, you have to do something about it. And we'll talk about that. So this is a graph I really like. It's from Ruth DeFries, a colleague of mine, and it's called the Big Ratchet. And I recommend you read it. It talks about agriculture. And through history, food production has gone up, and you reach a point where, uh-oh, we're not producing enough food. People have to reach a crisis, and then they ratchet it up. They do something. So a plow came in, or crop germplasm was some of the first things that came in to increase food production. Then plowing, then fertilizers, then organics, guano and things like that, and then fertilizers. So it's a really wonderful book, but you have to keep doing something different to that system if you want to intensify and get more food out of it. So this is a graph of the green revolution in Asia for rice. And again, those began on inherently fertile soils. Alluvial soils of the Indo-Gangetic Plains, parts of China. And you'll see this is years and different interventions that happened to increase the productivity, the yields of that rice. And I think it's interesting. Pardon me, I lost my glasses the other day, so these are old ones, so I can't see very well. But it's all about germplasm. The Asian Green Revolution was primarily about germplasm. And finally, over here, nitrogen fertilizer has to be applied. But not until like the 80s, the late 70s, where fertilizer's a real issue of managing it. They were adding it, but they became another one. Then we have tillage coming in and things like that. But you see, a lot of it was about germplasm. And later on, it became soils. Then, even in the Green Revolution in Latin America, particularly Brazil, the Green Revolution took place on inherently infertile acid soils. Several of you were at the World Congress of Soil Science in Brazil a few weeks ago, and were perhaps able to see some of the tremendous things that they've done with these acid infertile oxasols and ultisols of the Amazon, particularly the cerrados of Brazil. So here's a picture of a mollisol in Iowa, the US Midwest, the Corn Belt of the United States, and then the oxasol of Brazil. Currently, and we heard from our Brazilian colleagues, this is an old slide that says similar corn yields. They say they now have higher corn and soybean yields in the United States. And it's on a soil that would grow nothing without phosphorus. Nothing, I mean crop. It has wonderful vegetation, beautiful cerrado. But without phosphorus, no crop would grow. Without lime, no crop would grow. But now there's some of the highest productivity areas of the world. Okay. However, today, if you come to Africa, see, I've talked about Asia, I've talked about Latin America. There are parts of the world that did not experience the Green Revolution and still have not. And we're finding a real convergence of low fertility soils, low yields, and food insecurity. These are two maps. They're 2010, but it looks similar today. There might be a little bits of changes. This is a very interesting graph by Leo that came out, I believe it was Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States. It's called Global Crop Nitrogen Stress. Well, I added people, because what this does is it tells you the amount of nitrogen coming into the soils of those countries. The amount of nitrogen going into those soils, so it's fertilizer, manures, whatever. And if it's green, it's enough. And they do it in terms of enough nitrogen to produce protein. So I think it's a very, very interesting metric that they've come up with. The hatch marks, you'll see most of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Central Asia. What those hatch marks means, there's not enough nitrogen going into the soils of those countries to produce enough protein for people. It's striking. Not enough nitrogen. If you superimpose the global hunger index from IFPRI, these are the hungry places, and you can see why. There's not enough nitrogen even going into those soils to produce enough food, particularly proteins. So I find this quite compelling, quite a compelling story. Okay, so this is another interesting map. I like maps. I think they tell good stories. So despite the high prevalence of undernourishment, and there were some in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, these are the places that are growing food rather than feed. So look at that. These places are growing food, meaning corn to eat, not corn for livestock. And so isn't that odd that they're growing the food, yet that's where the hungry people are? They're also, most of them grown by smallholder farmers with less than 5 hectares. Most of the food produced in the world is grown by smallholder farmers. It's feed and things like that that are these large-scale agricultural systems. So it's interesting to keep that in your mind, food versus feed. There's another map that's the reverse, and it's the feed map. All right, so I'm going to start focusing now on sub-Saharan Africa. And so why do we have low yields and hungry people? Well, the method of slash and burn, and then after a while there's not very much to burn, continued without a fallow period to replenish the nutrients and without adding nutrients. And so IFDC produced these very interesting maps called soil nutrient depletion. Basically, it looks at the amount of nutrients added versus those being taken off. And you would hope you have more being added than taken off, right? Well, anyway, what they came up with is actually the soils of sub-Saharan Africa are being mined of nutrients. It's NPK. That's greater than 60 kilograms per hectare per year being depleted from the soils. Now, it's an old map. Some places will look better, others will look worse. It's not uniform, but I think they're very compelling maps again. And so the consequence of that is here's Asia. These are yields relative to 1960 is called the 100%. In Asia, they almost tripled the yields. Whereas in Africa, maybe not even 1.5. Or not, so they're very, very small. That's 10%, isn't it? Oh, sorry, about 30. All right? So not increases in yields. And this is a good way to think about it. This is the total of 12 different cereal crops grown around the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, average 1 ton per hectare. Latin America, 3. South and Southeast Asia, 3. China, 5. China says it's higher than that now. And the US, Europe, Japan, 10. So an order of magnitude difference between what could be produced and what is being produced. All right, so we've depleted the soils, but actually in tropical Africa, if you look at the constraints to production, soil acidity, high phosphorus fixation, they don't look as bad as Latin America or tropical Asia. Low nutrient reserves, yes, but not again as bad as a Cerrado. Water stress is a big issue in Africa. But overall, they're not so bad. But the soils have been depleted and degraded. And so I showed you that graph before where you take soils down, yields go down, and then you fallow and it goes up. With continuous cropping without adding nutrients, you deplete your yields as well as your soil stocks and many, many ecosystem services that go with it. So some colleagues and I sort of put together, and Steve McGrath, this is where we started thinking about this. Is this a system? You have to really look at the system. So you have agriculture without proper management. In this case, we'll talk about nutrients, not enough being added. Loss of nutrients increases soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, you degrade the environment. You have declining productivity and crop diversity. You have food insecurity, malnutrition, which leads to illness, which then gives declining labor productivity, less management of your agricultural fields, and just this vicious, vicious cycle. So there are many efforts now. People saw this link called unhealthy soils, unhealthy people. There's a paper in Nature about that. So the real focus for many people now is to turn this into a virtuous cycle. Better management gets you better yields, gets you healthier people, and brings back the environment. And so that's what many, many people are focusing their careers on. It's very exciting, I must say, to look at the real system with the people involved, the ecosystem, and the soils is a key part of that whole thing. All right, so for sub-Saharan Africa, I hope you're convinced now that adding nutrients is a key first step. It's not germplasm as it was in the Asian Green Revolution. Sure, you need better germplasm, but even if you have better germplasm in Africa, if you don't add nutrients, you're not going to get higher yields. It's very clear. There are many, many experiments that have shown that. So I really don't care if you add a bag of fertilizer, manure, legume cover crops, crop residues. I don't care that those soils need nutrients. The first step is just to get the nutrients in, and many people believe now it has to start from a bag of fertilizer. We can discuss that later if you'd like. But it gets the whole system going. Then you get more crop residues, then you get more organics, and then you can take the second steps of what's called ISFM, Integrated Soil Fertility Management, which is combining the mineral with the organic inputs. All right, so that's the system people are looking at and how to improve the soils. So here's just a graph from Andre Battiano in long-term trials where they looked at millet yields with a control, nothing added, less than a ton, and fertilizer and crop residues by themselves. But then if you add them, you get an added bonus, you get higher yields. And there are many, many, many experiments have shown the same. So again, there are these synergies I talked about. Those mineral fertilizers kickstart the system, producing more crops and the residues that you need to put back into those soils. And then organic inputs also usually increase the efficiency of use of those fertilizers. All right, so we have all these great things, but what's happening? This is a recent paper by Ephraim Nkonya from IFPRI, and they did household surveys in these different countries to look at, all right, who's using fertilizer? Who's adopting fertilizer? Some of these countries less than 20%, but a lot of people say 20% is actually a good adoption rate. For the goals, the large-scale increases in fertilizer use and food security we need, that's not enough. In Kenya's greater and Zambia greater. And then sub-Saharan Africa in general, not very good. Organic inputs. Kenya, they're quite large. Rwanda also. Improved seeds, but then look at ISFM. That means you put them all together. Remember, you need a system. You need to put it together. They're very low. My friend Bernard van Lau, who's the one that basically coined ISFM, he's very depressed when he sees things like this. But it takes time. It takes time. We're going somewhere. Here's another one on adoption. This is an older study, but this is for Zambia, looking at the adoption of crop rotations, kraal manure, mineral fertilizer, improved fallow. But this is interesting because it was broken down into wealth categories. So you'll see the well-off use a lot of manure because they can afford cows. It's a system with positive feedbacks that goes with it, whereas the very poor, very little manure. But they do have, surprisingly, large amounts of mineral fertilizer. And that's because Zambia has had long-term trends of subsidizing fertilizers. Now, a lot of people, it's very controversial, fertilizer subsidies. But in some places, it's been done fairly well, and it has had dramatic successes. All right, so in Konya, Ephraim in Konya goes a step further, and they look at the profitability of adopting these different things. And so here's adoption rate, ISFM very little, and just doing nothing. And then you look at the profit, and it's the reverse. So what's going on? Why are these farmers not doing something that's going to get them more money? There are lots of reasons, all right? Scientists think we have all these great things, researchers, we know this work, it's fantastic. And to go out in the field and not see them being taken up it's crushing, I must say. And that's why it's also important to work with economists, sociologists, so you really understand the system better. Well, one thing is that many countries have blanket fertilizer recommendations for the entire country. Some have broken it down to parts of their countries, but very often it's just nitrogen and phosphorus. In other places it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In a few places they even add sulfur. But basically it's nitrogen and phosphorus. And maybe that's not the problem. So farmers have a risk. Availability of inputs, mineral as well as organic. Mineral fertilizers, here's the cost, this should be down here. But this is, Bernard van Lau took this recently in DRC Congo. The price of urea in Congo is what, 4 times that of the market price. And that just happens, it depends where you are, but in most places in Africa, the price of fertilizers is much higher than the market price, the world market price. Organics, people think, well, organics are out there, use them. In many of these depleted systems, they're not extra organics. They're being fed to livestock if there are livestock, or they're of very low quality because the soils are of low quality. And so they're not very good in terms of replenishing soil nutrients. They're competition for other uses of crop residues and other organics, for feed, for fuel. They take up land. If you don't have much land, why would I put my field in a field of legumes if it's not going to give me an immediate benefit or maybe even a medium-term benefit? And labor requirements. For anything, many things you think farmers should be doing, it's added labor. And so there's lots of reasons they don't adopt. And climate variability. When do the rains start? When do you plant? Are you going to get enough rain? If it starts, are they going to be there long enough, or is there going to be a dry spell? These are all huge risks to farmers. And if they're going to invest, they need to know that they're going to get a return. And many of these will tell them, you might not get a return. And another one, critical issue in much of sub-Saharan Africa is land tenure. People will not invest in their soils or their land unless they have some secure right to that land. And so these are all issues, despite being agronomists working on doing things better, knowing we can increase yields, there are lots of reasons why farmers aren't doing that. All right, so I'm going to talk about the first one, blanket recommendations. There's a series of experiments. These are by Job Kihara of CIOT. And basically, you look at NPK, so that's what most countries recommend. And then this is if you don't increase K, or you don't include K. So it's a nitrogen-phosphorus response. But look at that. It doesn't make a difference. So people are applying K when they really don't need to. That's added money, okay? It's money you don't need to spend. If you take out nitrogen, well, the yields are much higher if you have nitrogen. Almost all soils, as we know, need nitrogen fertilizer. If you don't add P, there are some soils, it doesn't matter. Okay, but there are some where it does, and that's below the line. Here you add micronutrients. So it's showing here, some of these soils you actually need micronutrients. There are micronutrient problems. It could be sulfur. A lot of people think sulfur is the big missing element in the soils of Africa right now. And if you add manure, which also provides micronutrients, you can do better in many of these soils. So that's the type of stuff people need to do. What kind of fertilizers or nutrients do people need to be adding to these soils so that they'll get a good response, so they'll get a return to their money? There are lots of efforts to do that. The value-cost ratio, that means what you got out from the system from selling was more than you had to buy. And usually economists say you have value-cost ratio greater than 2 is when people will start doing something. It's profitable enough for them. And so what Job found is they found a value-cost ratio, in some cases only 25%, had a value-cost ratio greater than 2. If I'm a farmer and I only have a 25% chance of getting a profit, I'm not going to do it. Others were 60 and above. And so that's why farmers are wondering, why am I doing this? I'm not making a profit, so I won't do that. There's something that a lot of people have been noticing. So look at all these gray squares, cluster 1. It doesn't seem to matter what you add to those soils. In this case, they're not getting much of a yield. And so this term non-responsive soils has shown up. And people are looking at it. I had a National Science Foundation project where we tried to explore, are these really non-responsive? Why are there certain kinds of soils while this happens? So here you have 2 different fields. On the top, it's with fertilizer on both sides, and below without. On this side, you'll see without fertilizer, maize and soybean do poorly. You give fertilizer, they both do well. On this side, however, without fertilizer, maize does terribly, but soybean looks great. You add fertilizer, maize doesn't look so good, but soybean looks great. And so farmers, these are actual farmers' fields. So how can you figure out, do I need to add fertilizer? Am I going to get a response? This is just some summary tables. This is still a work in progress. But this is telling you, we did it in different places, in Kenya, in DRC Congo, and Tanzania, on different soils. So we tried to look at different mineralogies, different textures, different slopes to figure out what might be affecting or causing this non-responsiveness. And we did it for 2 seasons. And this is a summary table. So this is cases where you had less than a ton advantage when you added NPK over the control. So you added, so one is 0 fertilizer, the other is NPK. You would hope you got a big response. So you'll notice that in some cases, percent of the fields, only 9% didn't have an increase of more than half a ton. But you look at here in DRC Congo, almost half of those fields didn't even get a half a ton increase. And so again, a farmer is going to wonder why. In Kenya, there was a very different response for 2 seasons. In Tanzania, it was also seasonal. and it has to do with rainfall patterns. So it's not just soils. In Congo, it is soils to a large extent, but it's also climate. Because in a good year, they did really well. They had more than 63% of the fields with more than 1 ton over the control. And some of them went up to 2 tons. So you can see why farmers get confused about fertilizers. And these are the value-cost ratios. It's a complicated graph, but it's cumulative probabilities. This is just pointing the data. And remember, value-cost ratio of 2, above that is when it's profitable to a farmer. Nigeria, it was never profitable. Tanzania, only once you got to 80%, so only 20% of the farmers' fields would have had profitability. Kenya, you had a lot more. The profitability was great. Okay, so it differs. It varies with soil type. We don't have all the data. Part of it is mineralogy. Kenya has more 2-to-1 minerals than any of the other soils. It has higher baseline yields and a much higher response. DRC Congo has high clay, but it's primarily kaolinite and gibbsite. And Nigeria is a very sandy soil. And so there are different factors. We're still trying to tease apart the data to see if you can help target for fertilizers. So targeting fertilizer, I have about 15 minutes. So targeting fertilizers is what a lot of people are doing now. How do we get better recommendations for farmers so that their risks are smaller, they get higher yields, and they have higher efficiency of nutrient use and therefore profitability? Okay, so these multiple approaches are being done, several people in this room, but the diagnosis and mapping of soil nutrient deficiencies or toxicities is being done by large groups of people. It's being funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, DFID, many, many countries, USAID funds IFDC and things like that. And people have their own pet way they want to do it. Steve McGrath works with my colleagues in AFSIS using spectral analysis. It's fast. You can do many, many samples very quickly with near-infrared, mid-infrared. Wet chemistry. IFDC insists you have to do wet chemistry, that's the best way to do it because you can make better predictions about crop response. And then other groups like the International Plant Nutrition Institute, they just go straight to the field and put crops out there with missing nutrient trials because they don't think soil data tells you very much. Sad to hear that when you see all these people doing soil tests, but it takes a long time to really calibrate a soil test. Anyway, I think people have agreed now you actually need all of these approaches and to look at them together to really come up with proper recommendations for improved nutrient management, including fertilizer blends. So it's not just for the farmer, it's for the companies out there making and selling fertilizer. They want to sell more fertilizer, and if they find out farmers aren't buying fertilizer, they're trying to figure out why also. And so many fertilizer companies are actually funding these trials. They've done a huge thing over the whole part of northern Nigeria the last 2 years. Anyway, the idea is to get accessible, affordable, targeted soil nutrient management recommendations and improve fertilizer blends. Most farmers in Africa cannot get a soil tested. They cannot get a soil tested. There are very few labs that can do it and do it well. There are a lot of labs, many of them don't do it well. And it costs a lot of money. Even for me as a researcher, it cost me $50 a sample, and I'm going, wait a minute. And these are service labs, so it's very expensive. And so we need to find out better ways so that extension agents, farmers, companies can really find out how to replenish the soils in Africa. This is just some examples from Marcus Walsh, who's part of the AFSIS group. This is soil acidity they did for Nigeria. And again, I can't see that very well. But here are the little patches where soil acidity is showing up. There's big discussions now because the soils of Africa are not that acid. But in some places, acidity, and where they are, it's usually an inherent property. but it's starting to develop as soils are degrading. So people are really trying to figure out, where do we really need to lime soils in Africa? If you can't get people to add nutrients, why do you also want them to now add lime? Maybe they'll get a better response. And then another thing that AFSIS is doing, in addition to, so they do these maps through targeted field sampling, overlays of topography, all sorts of other soil information. And now they're actually going out using all sorts of different soil features, and you can get all these soil features online, to decide where to sample, to validate some of the soil tests or some of their soil maps. And they're doing crop response trials. They've been working with groups in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, and other places. So it's to validate their maps that indicate where there would be nutrient deficiencies and probably crop response. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to the sustainability parts of this. Okay, so here's North China. That was part of the big Asian Green Revolution. And this is nitrogen balance by region. So you look at the nitrogen inputs. This is kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, almost 600 kilograms. And they're taking out, and this is for maize, taking out 361, left with a very large nutrient nitrogen surplus in that soil. And as we all know, nitrogen is not just going to sit there. It's going to be emitted as gas. It's going to leach into the groundwater. It will erode and run off into rivers. Then I put Western Kenya, a place where Liz worked for several years. Nitrogen input to crops, 7 kilograms per hectare. Oh, but wait, they're taking out a lot more. And so here is this soil mining. Just like that IFDC map, this is from one farm in Kenya. I won't go over the US because the US actually used to look like this, and they're starting to clean up their act, as I should say, and the rivers. The rivers haven't cleaned up yet, and that's another issue. So anyway, so this is that second part of SDG 2. It's the sustainability part. It's to maintain healthy ecosystems. And so the challenge to us is, as we hit this low spot and want to increase yields and increase ecosystem services, how do you increase yields and reduce environmental impacts, or even make your environment better in the case of China? How do you recuperate ecosystem services on those degraded soils? Is mineral fertilizers going to do it? And you also have to look at the social and economic outcomes as we've seen. In other words, how can you keep on increasing yields, but not at the expense of the environment, which happened in the Asian Green Revolution? So that is a real challenge for this African Green Revolution, and I call it the Asian Green Revolution Stage 2, the sustainability issues. Just quickly, this is experiments we set up in Western Kenya. We looked at different rates of nitrogen addition, and we wanted to look at, of course, at yields, but also greenhouse gas emissions. My colleague Jonathan Hickman did that, and nitrate leaching. Kate Tully did those experiments. Here are just the bottom line. Here's the nitrous oxide emissions. This is Kenya, which is a clay soil, and also one in Tanzania on a sandy soil. What you'll see here are different curves, basically, for the different rates. These rates are not showing much difference. It's when you get above 100 to 150 kilograms of nitrogen, you start really getting increased nitrous oxide emissions. So if you have Africa that's applying 10 to 20 kilograms of nitrogen, you can still add a lot more nitrogen, increase your yields, and not increase nitrous oxide emissions. People find that hard to believe, but there are more and more sites now showing that, even in the United States. It seems to be the same threshold around that. And the losses are less than 0.2% of the nitrogen added. And the IPCC guidelines, default guidelines, is 1%. So they're much less when you're working in this part of the curve, the responsive part of the curve. Nitrogen in the soil, but the plants are going like crazy, so they're taking it up at those rates. This is a nitrogen budget. It's a bit complicated between the clay soil in Kenya and the sandy soil. The green is crop harvest. Is that green? Yeah. Gas, you'll see, is very little. And then leaching. The bottom line is in the Kenya soil, you got great crop response to the nitrogen. And your budget, it was zero. It was large when you had 0 nitrogen added. It was still large, negative budget, when you added 50 kilograms, even negative when you added 75. It only started to get a positive budget, meaning you had 27 kilos left in that soil when you added 200. So you have a long way to go to flip these budgets. People think a little bit of nitrogen and you're going to flip your budgets into not mining but contaminating the soil. In Tanzania, on the sandy soil, it's a very different story. Basically, you add nitrogen, it leaches through. Or it sticks on the topsoil. There's not water. So it's a climate and a soil interaction. And so every place is going to be different. You can't just say, oh, adding lots of nitrogen, you're really going to mess up the environment of Africa. It depends on where you are and what kind of soil and what kind of climate you have. Just a positive note about many tropical soils. So these are 3 different profiles. This is Kenya, Tanzania, and this is Brazilian Cerrado. I think this was just published last week, actually, in Nature Climate Change. So this is extractable nitrate on all of these, and this is depth in the profile. And what it's showing is that there's a buildup of nitrate anywhere from 50 centimeters, that's meters here. In Brazil, they're very deep soils. At 4 meters, you find a bulge of nitrate. Here's another one in Kenya at about 50 centimeters. It's anion exchange capacity on these variable charge clays. Okay, highly weathered clays. They hold on to that nitrate, so it's not leaching through. In Brazil, my friends have actually looked at the water in the rivers and the streams. They're not finding any nitrogen in those streams, even after applying nitrogen for many years. It's sticking in the soil. Now, how long it can stay there, we don't know. But at least that is a positive look at adding nitrogen and not having it contaminate the environment. So we need to target. I hope you got the message from that. You need to target what kind of nutrients you need to add, what kind of soil you need to add them to. And so here's an example. Some colleagues and I just said, all right, so let's just say, what are we going to do? People are worried about intensification from the environmental side. I'm more concerned about intensification to feed people, but we have to look at it as a system because I'm also an ecologist. So let's say we want to have increased yields and profitability. So you need suitability maps. This is a maize suitability map from IASA, where it could go. So we picked these top 3 ones. Then we said, all right, let's have minimal impact on leaching and greenhouse gases. So we want it to be clay and to be deep. And so we use AFSIS maps, digital elevation maps. And then we also said, and you can't cut down the forest. So where are those places? And this is just an example. You could pick your own. We also did slope. So you could play around with these. But 72% of that area was already croplands that we found had those soil features. So that's already good to know. You just intensify. You put fertilizers on those soils. And I think as we work with governments, with donors, with projects, with scientists, I think more and more we can target getting the right nutrients in the right places. We will increase food production as well as protect the environment. So, in summary, there is progress. You have 3 countries, Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia. You have fertilizer use, 1990, and it's the last 10 to 15 years. Fertilizer kilograms per hectare, from 10 up to 50. Mozambique, nothing. Well, 0 to 10. That's not enough. Yields also going up. Malawi and Zambia. Mozambique, not really, staying around that 1 ton. You look at the curves, you're getting from that 1 to 3 that we talked about. So there is progress in some places, but with very large inefficiencies when we just talk about 1 to 3 tons. And there are huge risks to farmers until they get the right fertilizers on the right soils. And then the concluding side is we can get beyond 3 and get even to 5. By increasing access to seeds and fertilizers, we can get to 1 to 3, and we're seeing it happen. The thing about Malawi and Zambia on this previous slide, they've both had fertilizer subsidy programs. Mozambique has not. So as much as you might not like subsidies, the countries that are making progress, Ethiopia, Zambia, Malawi, they're making progress. Not all of them that do subsidies are making progress. Those are really trying to target R. Okay, if you want to go from 3 to 5, it's going to require more. And it's going to require things outside of soil science. It's going to involve changing the production system, targeting better recommendations, but credit systems, in crop insurance, and markets that work. It can be done. I think it can be done also in rehabilitating soils and at the same time minimizing the negative environmental effects of increasing crop production and reducing hunger in Africa. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. Very powerful last slide, I must say. We've got time for one very quick question for Cheryl, if there is one. Otherwise, you're around for the rest of the conference.
Yeah, I'll be around the whole time.
So I saw Steve first, so Steve, you get in.
Can I just ask, what do you say to people who say, contrary to what you probe, which is you need nutrients, that you just need to kind of recycle the nutrients that are already there? You made the case, I think, quite compellingly, that you need fertilizers.
So the question is, why don't you just recycle what's there? So if you have a crop of 1 ton of maize, that means you have 1 ton of residue, right? It might have 2% nitrogen in it, so what is that? How many kilos of N? 20? Or 2? I can never do factors of 10. You just don't have many nutrients. It's not enough. It's poor quality. I've done experiments where I've even used those residues, and they've immobilized nitrogen and phosphorus. They're very poor quality. You use manures, so there's competition for feeding your livestock. You use manures from those poor inputs, organic inputs. The manure has even immobilized nitrogen and phosphorus. So you can recycle it, but it's recycling very little and a very poor quality, and it recycles poverty. Right.
Okay, so thank you very much, Cheryl. So a very inspiring talk and excellent start to our conference. Cheryl, before you rush off, in recognition of giving our Russell Lecture, on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I'd like to present you with this.
Thank you.